but these people have also been waiting. It will only be a few minutes.
A few minutes? I don't pay a fortune to live in this city to have my morning ruined by this filth!
The sun was still gentle, a pale yellow wash over the manicured lawns of Cedar Creek. It was the kind of Tuesday morning that suburban dreams were made of, quiet, orderly, and deeply predictable. The only sounds were the distant hum of a lawnmower and the cheerful, insistent chirping of a robin perched on a perfectly trimmed hedge. At 8:17 a.m., Marcus Thorne stepped out onto his front porch, a ceramic mug steaming with coffee in one hand. He was dressed in the unofficial uniform of a man with nowhere to be on a weekday morning, a gray, fleece-lined hoodie, well-worn basketball shorts, and a pair of simple slides. The air was cool against his bare legs, a pleasant remnant of the night. He took a slow sip of his coffee, the warmth a welcome contrast to the morning chill, and walked down the 3 short steps of his brick porch to the mailbox at the curb. The house behind him was a handsome 2-story colonial, its dark blue siding and white trim a testament to careful ownership. It wasn't his, not originally. It had been his mother's sanctuary, the place she had bought with her own hard-earned money and filled with law books, art, and the scent of baking bread. Now, it was his responsibility, a legacy he was still learning to inhabit since her passing 6 months ago. The thought brought a familiar, dull ache to his chest, one he pushed down with practiced ease. The metal flap of the mailbox squeaked in protest as he opened it. Inside was a small collection of envelopes, a bill from the electric company, a glossy circular from a local supermarket, a letter from his alma mater asking for donations, and a postcard from his sister, Lena, who was vacationing in Colorado. He smiled at the picture of a snow-capped mountain on the front. He stood there for a moment, sorting through the mail, his back to the street. He was lost in the simple, domestic rhythm of the task, his mind 1,000 miles away, somewhere between a balance sheet for work and a memory of his mother gardening in the very spot where he now stood. He didn't notice the patrol car until it had already passed his house, slowed, and made a U-turn. He didn't hear the near-silent electric whir of its engine as it crept back and came to a stop directly across the street. His first indication that his morning had fundamentally changed was the sound of a car door opening and closing with a solid, authoritative thud. Officer Dean Hess stepped onto the pavement, his boots making a soft crunch on a stray leaf. At 36, Hess carried himself with the rigid posture of a man who believed his uniform was a suit of armor. He had a square jaw, closely cropped sandy blonde hair, and eyes the color of a washed-out sky. He had been a cop for 8 years, long enough to see his initial desire to make a difference curdle into a hardened cynicism. He saw the world in simple terms. There were predators and there was prey, and his job was to keep the predators out of neighborhoods like this. Cedar Creek was his territory, a clean, safe enclave that he patrolled with a fierce proprietary zeal. From his perspective, the scene in front of him was an anomaly, a black man in a hoodie and shorts standing by a mailbox. That in itself was not a crime, but the man didn't look like he belonged. Hess couldn't have articulated why he felt that way, not in any language that would hold up in a report. It was a gut feeling, an instinct honed by years of seeing things that were out of place. The man's car wasn't in the driveway. He seemed to be lingering. The pieces clicked together in Hess's mind, forming a picture he had already decided was true. Mail theft. It was a common, low-level crime that could lead to bigger things like identity theft and fraud. It was exactly the kind of rot he was sworn to cut out. He didn't run the plates on the silver sedan parked in the driveway. He didn't check the property records on his in-car terminal to see who the registered owner of 412 Chestnut Drive was. He didn't consider the dozens of innocent explanations for what he was seeing. His mind, fueled by an implicit bias he would have vehemently denied possessing, had already rendered a verdict. All that remained was the formality of gathering the evidence. Marcus finally looked up from his sister's postcard, his smile fading as he registered the officer standing across the street. The man's stare was intense, unwavering. His hand wasn't on his gun, but it was close, resting casually on his duty belt in a way that was anything but casual. It was a posture of readiness, of expectation. Marcus felt a familiar, unwelcome coil of anxiety tighten in his stomach. He was a 42-year-old accountant with a master's degree and a spotless record, but in that moment, he felt like a teenager again, caught in a place he wasn't supposed to be. "Morning, officer," Marcus said, his voice steady, friendly. He gave a small nod, a universal sign of non-threatening acknowledgement. Hess didn't return the greeting. He just continued to stare, his eyes cataloging every detail. The hoodie, the bare legs, the mail held loosely in Marcus's hand. He began to walk across the street, not with the easy gait of an officer making a community check-in, but with the deliberate, measured stride of a hunter approaching his quarry. The sun was rising higher now, casting long shadows across the lawn. The robin had stopped singing. The quiet of the morning was no longer peaceful. It was heavy, charged with a silent, gathering tension. The ordinary Tuesday was over. Officer Hess stopped about 10 feet away from Marcus, a calculated distance that established control. It forced Marcus to look up slightly, creating an immediate, subtle power imbalance. The silence stretched for a few seconds, a deliberate tool Hess used to make people uncomfortable, to knock them off balance before the first question was even asked. "What are you doing here?" Hess's voice was flat, devoid of courtesy. It wasn't a question, it was an accusation wrapped in an interrogative. Marcus blinked, taken aback by the immediate hostility. He'd had his share of interactions with the police over the years, mostly traffic stops for a busted taillight or a rolling stop, and they had always begun with a degree of professional decorum. This was different. This was pure suspicion. "I'm just getting my mail," Marcus replied, his voice still calm, though the knot in his stomach had tightened. He held up the envelope slightly, a gesture of transparency. "I live here." Hess's lips curled into a faint, dismissive smirk. It was a micro-expression lasting only a second, but it communicated a universe of disbelief. It said, "Nice try. I've heard that one before." "You live here," he repeated, the words dripping with sarcasm. "Is that so?" "Yes, sir. At 412 Chestnut Drive," Marcus said, gesturing with his head toward the house behind him. He made a conscious effort to keep his tone even, to project cooperation. He knew the unwritten rules for encounters like this. Stay calm. Be respectful. Don't make any sudden moves. Show them you are not a threat. "Funny," Hess said, taking another step forward. "Been patrolling this neighborhood for 5 years. Never seen you before." The implication was clear. If Hess hadn't seen him, he didn't belong. Marcus's existence in his own home was subject to this officer's personal verification. "I've been living here for about 6 months," Marcus explained patiently. "It was my mother's house. She passed away last year." He offered this personal detail as an olive branch, a piece of his story to bridge the chasm of suspicion that had opened between them. He was trying to give the officer a narrative he could understand, a reason for his presence that fit into the orderly world of Cedar Creek. Hess ignored it completely. The information was irrelevant to the conclusion he had already drawn. "I see you've got a handful of mail there," he said, his eyes fixed on the envelopes in Marcus's hand. "Whose name is on it?" This was the moment Marcus knew this wasn't going to be resolved with a simple conversation. The officer wasn't trying to understand, he was trying to build a case. A profound sense of weariness washed over him, followed by a surge of indignation. He was standing on his own property, holding his own mail, and being treated like a common criminal. "It's in my name," Marcus said, his voice a little firmer now. He looked down at the top envelope, the one from the electric company. He held it out for the officer to see, his thumb carefully positioned so the name and address were clearly visible. "Marcus Thorne, 412 Chestnut Drive. See for yourself." This was it, the incontrovertible proof, the piece of evidence that should have ended the entire encounter, that should have prompted a curt nod, maybe even a reluctant apology, before the officer returned to his car. A reasonable officer would have glanced at the name, registered the address, and concluded that a mistake had been made. But Dean Hess was not a reasonable officer, not at that moment. His judgment was clouded by a stubborn cocktail of pride and prejudice. Admitting he was wrong would mean admitting his initial instinct was flawed. In his mind, Marcus holding a bill with his name on it wasn't proof of residency, it was evidence of a more sophisticated crime. The suspect had likely stolen the mail and was sorting through it for valuables. This act of presenting the mail as proof was, to Hess, a brazen act of defiance. It was a lie, thrown right in his face. He barely glanced at the envelope. His focus was on Marcus's face, searching for a flicker of guilt, a sign of deception. He saw only a steady, challenging gaze. This was his first critical mistake, a willful disregard for exculpatory evidence. "I'm going to need to see some identification," Hess demanded, his tone hardening. The request was now an order. "Driver's license, now." "Officer, I just showed you my mail with my name and this address on it," Marcus stated, trying to keep the frustration out of his voice. "Why do you need to see my ID? Am I being detained for something?" He knew he was within his rights to ask the question. He wasn't operating a vehicle. He was standing on his own property. In the absence of reasonable suspicion of a crime, the officer couldn't compel him to identify himself. But he also knew that for a man who looked like him, asserting his rights to an officer like Hess was like throwing gasoline on a fire. And the fire came. Hess's face flushed a dull red. His jaw tightened. The perceived challenge to his authority was more infuriating than the suspected crime itself. "You're being detained for investigation of mail theft," Hess snapped, the words sharp and final. "Now give me your ID or I'm going to add resisting arrest to the charges." The threat hung in the air, heavy and absolute. Hess had just invented a crime and now he was threatening to invent a second one to punish Marcus for questioning the first. This was his second catastrophic mistake. Instead of de-escalating when presented with contradictory evidence, he doubled down, escalating the confrontation from a suspicious inquiry to a criminal detention, locking them both onto a path from which it would be nearly impossible to turn back. The quiet suburban street was now the scene of a crime, but the crime wasn't theft. It was an abuse of power, unfolding in the bright morning sun. The shift in the air was palpable. The pretense of a routine check was gone, replaced by the raw, undisguised exercise of authority. Hess's threat to add a resisting charge wasn't a negotiation. It was the drawing of a line in the sand. For Marcus, the options narrowed with sickening speed. He could refuse, stand his ground on principle, and almost certainly end up physically assaulted and charged with multiple felonies. Or he could comply, surrendering his rights in the hope of surviving the encounter. It was a choice no innocent person should ever have to make. "My wallet is inside the house," Marcus said, his voice tight with a carefully controlled anger. "On the kitchen counter." He deliberately did not say, "Let me go get it." He knew that making a move toward the house, no matter how innocent, could be interpreted as an attempt to flee or retrieve a weapon. He stood perfectly still, his hands visible. "Stay right where you are," Hess commanded, as if Marcus had any intention of doing otherwise. Hess unclipped the radio from his shoulder. His thumb pressed the transmit button. "Dispatch, this is 3 Charlie 15. Show me at 412 Chestnut. I have one male detained, possible 531 in progress. Requesting a second unit." The codes were spoken in a clipped professional monotone, but to Marcus, they landed like hammer blows. 531 was the penal code for mail theft. Requesting a second unit. The words echoed in the quiet street. He was now officially a suspect, a potential threat requiring backup. The absurdity of it was staggering. A moment ago, he was thinking about his sister's vacation. Now he was the reason sirens would soon be tearing through his peaceful neighborhood. "Officer, this is completely unnecessary," Marcus said, his voice low but urgent. "My name is Marcus Thorne. My ID is right inside. We can clear this up in 30 seconds. He was pleading now, not for mercy, but for simple reason. He was appealing to the logic he assumed must still exist somewhere beneath the uniform and the aggression. Hess ignored him, his attention on the radio as he waited for confirmation from dispatch. To Hess, Marcus's pleas for reason were just the predictable script of a guilty man trying to talk his way out of a jam. The more the suspect talked, the more convinced Hess became of his guilt. This was confirmation bias in its purest, most dangerous form. He had decided Marcus was a criminal, and now every action Marcus took was being filtered through that lens. Cooperation was cunning. Pleading was a sign of desperation. From down the street, Mrs. Gable, an elderly woman who had lived on Chestnut Drive for 40 years, peered through the blinds of her living room window. She saw the police car, the officer, and Marcus, the nice, quiet man who had helped her carry her groceries in just last week. She couldn't hear what they were saying, but the officer's rigid posture and Marcus's stillness told a story of conflict. A flicker of concern crossed her face. This wasn't right. The backup unit arrived in under 2 minutes, foregoing the siren but announcing its arrival with the strobing flash of its red and blue LED lights. The beams bounced off the windows of the houses, a silent alarm that drew more neighbors to their windows. A second officer, Maria Ramirez, stepped out of the passenger side. She was younger than Hess, barely 30, with a sharp, intelligent face and a reputation for being thorough. She had been partnered with Hess for 6 months, a period during which she had grown increasingly uneasy with his short temper and his tendency to see threats where none existed. She walked up to the scene, her eyes taking in the details with a quick, practiced scan. She saw Hess, tense and confrontational. She saw Marcus, standing still and quiet, his hands held slightly away from his body. She saw the mail scattered on the ground near his feet where he had dropped it in shock. Her gaze fell on the top envelope. Even from a few feet away, she could read the name, M. Thorne, and the address, 412 Chestnut Drive. A knot of apprehension formed in her stomach. This was off. It felt wrong. "Dean," she said, her voice quiet, addressing her partner, "what's going on?" "Caught this guy rooting through the mailbox," Hess said without looking at her. His focus remained entirely on Marcus. "Claims he lives here. He's refusing to provide ID." This was a deliberate, calculated lie. Marcus hadn't refused. He had stated his wallet was inside. He hadn't been rooting through the mailbox. He was holding his own mail. Hess was twisting the facts to fit his narrative, both for the benefit of his backup and for the official record he was already composing in his head. This was his third critical mistake: misrepresenting the facts to a fellow officer, poisoning the well, and ensuring the situation would continue to escalate based on false pretenses. Ramirez looked from the mail on the ground back to Marcus. She was a good cop, trained to observe and analyze, and what she observed didn't align with what Hess was telling her. Suspects caught red-handed were rarely this calm. The evidence literally at his feet seemed to exonerate him. "His mail is right there, Dean," she said, gesturing with her chin. "It's got this address on it." She was trying to offer him a way out, a chance to recalibrate, to step back from the brink. She was speaking in a low voice, trying not to undermine his authority in front of the suspect, but the urgency was clear. "Look at the evidence!" Hess shot her a venomous glare. The look said, "Whose side are you on?" He saw her caution not as good police work, but as a betrayal. In his world, partners backed each other's plays, no questions asked. Her questioning his judgment, even subtly, was an act of insubordination. He could have grabbed it and be sorting through it. "I need to secure the scene, Maria. Watch him." The order was a dismissal. He turned his back on her and on reason itself. The path to de-escalation that Ramirez had tried to open was now firmly closed. The presence of a second officer, which should have introduced a note of caution and objectivity, had only served to entrench Hess in his position. He couldn't back down now, not in front of his junior partner. His pride was on the line, and in that moment his pride was more important than the truth. The stage was set for a physical confrontation, an outcome that was now not just possible, but inevitable. The arrival of the second patrol car acted as a point of no return. With an audience of a fellow officer and the now undeniably watching neighbors, Officer Hess's ego was fully engaged. Backing down was no longer an option. It would be an admission of a colossal error in judgment. He had to see it through. He had to be right. "All right, I've had enough of this," Hess announced to the morning air. He strode forward, closing the remaining distance between himself and Marcus. "Turn around. Put your hands behind your back." Marcus stood frozen for a second, a wave of disbelief washing over him. This wasn't happening. It couldn't be. "Officer, for what?" he asked, his voice a mixture of pleading and outrage. "I haven't done anything wrong. This is my home. You failed to provide identification, and you're obstructing my investigation," Hess barked, rattling off the boilerplate phrases that would later appear in his report. The words were a flimsy pretext, a legalistic shield for the raw prejudice driving his actions. "Turn around. Now!" Before Marcus could fully process the command, Hess was on him. He grabbed Marcus's left arm and wrenched it behind his back with a force that was completely unnecessary. Pain, sharp and electric, shot up Marcus's shoulder. The sudden violence of the act was a shock to his system. He instinctively tensed up, a natural reaction to being physically assaulted. Hess interpreted this involuntary response as resistance. "Stop resisting!" he yelled, the words a performance for his partner and for any potential civilian recordings. It was a classic, ugly tactic. Create the resistance yourself, then use it as justification for more violence. He kicked his leg behind Marcus's feet, sweeping him off balance. Marcus stumbled forward, his free hand reaching out to break his fall, but there was nothing to grab. He landed hard on the soft, damp grass of his own front lawn, the impact knocking the wind out of him. The world tilted, a confusing blur of green grass and blue sky. His coffee mug, which he had somehow held onto until that moment, slipped from his grasp and shattered on the walkway, the brown liquid pooling next to the scattered white envelopes. Officer Ramirez flinched, her hand moving toward her own radio before she stopped herself. This was escalating far too quickly. This was wrong. Her training screamed at her that the use of force was wildly disproportionate to the situation. There was no threat, no flight risk, no resistance other than the officer's own manufactured version of it. But she was the junior partner. Intervening physically, challenging a senior officer's use of force on the scene, was a line few cops were willing to cross. It was a career-ending move. So she stood there, a witness trapped by the very uniform she wore, her gut churning with a sick mix of fear and shame. Hess dropped a knee heavily into the center of Marcus's back, pressing his face into the cool, slightly damp earth. Marcus could smell the soil, feel the tickle of a blade of grass against his cheek. He gasped for air, his lungs struggling to expand under the officer's weight. "I'm not resisting," he managed to choke out, his voice muffled by the lawn. "You're hurting me!" Hess ignored him, pulling Marcus's other arm back and ratcheting the cold metal of the handcuffs around his wrists. They bit into his skin, cinched far too tightly. He tested them, ensuring they were secure, his movements rough and efficient. From the windows of the surrounding houses, the neighbors watched in stunned silence. They saw Marcus Thorne, the man who waved to them on his morning jogs, the son of the revered Evelyn Thorne, being pinned to his own lawn like a dangerous animal. The scene was surreal, a violent intrusion into their placid suburban reality. With Marcus secured, Hess stood up, pulling him to his feet with a rough jerk on the cuffs. The humiliation was a physical force, a hot wave that washed over Marcus. He was on display, cuffed and disheveled, in front of the homes of people he saw every day. His mail, the catalyst for this whole nightmare, lay scattered at his feet, a stark, ironic symbol of his violated privacy and his stolen dignity. Hess began his pat-down, his hands moving over Marcus's body with a detached, impersonal roughness. He wasn't searching for weapons. He knew there weren't any. This was part of the ritual of degradation, of asserting complete and total dominance. "See what happens when you don't cooperate?" Hess said, his voice low and laced with a triumphant spite. He was no longer just an officer of the law. He was a conqueror, standing over his vanquished foe. He was convinced he had done his job. that he had removed a threat from his neighborhood. He genuinely believed his actions were justified. In his mind, he had faced down a defiant suspect and won. This profound and dangerous self-deception was perhaps his most critical failure of all, the inability to recognize his own bigotry, even as it played out in broad daylight on a perfectly manicured lawn. He pushed Marcus toward Ramirez. "Put him in your car," he ordered. Then he turned his attention to the evidence. He knelt down and began gathering the scattered envelopes, his movements deliberate. He would book this mail into evidence, proof of the crime. The letter from Marcus's sister, the bill from the electric company, they were no longer personal correspondence. They were exhibits in the state's case against Marcus Thorne. As he picked them up, he began to construct the official story in his report, a work of fiction that would cast himself as the hero and the innocent man now sitting in the back of a patrol car as the villain. The back of a police car is a uniquely isolating space. It's a cage on wheels, designed to strip away dignity and humanity. The hard plastic of the seat is molded for discomfort, the windows don't open, and a thick plexiglass divider separates the occupant from the officers in the front, creating a sense of being both on display and completely cut off. For Marcus, the short ride from his home to the precinct was a surreal journey through a town he no longer recognized. The familiar streets of Cedar Creek, lined with oak trees and charming houses, looked alien and hostile through the barred window. Officer Ramirez drove, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles were white. She didn't speak. The silence in the car was thick with her unvoiced objections and her shame. Beside her, Officer Hess was busy, tapping away on the ruggedized laptop mounted between their seats. He was starting his report, getting his version of events down while they were still fresh and malleable. He typed with a focused intensity, his brow furrowed in concentration. He was no longer just an officer, he was an author, crafting a narrative. Subject was observed loitering near the mailbox at 412 Chestnut, he muttered to himself as he typed. When approached, subject became evasive and belligerent. Marcus could hear him from the back. The words were a physical blow, each one a brick in the wall of lies being built around him. Evasive? Belligerent? He had been calm. He had been compliant, right up until the moment he was assaulted. He wanted to scream, to correct the record, to tell Ramirez that her partner was a liar. But he knew it was pointless. Who would they believe? He was a suspect in the back of a police car. Hess was a uniformed officer in the front. The system was designed to believe one of them and not the other. As they pulled into the sally port of the Northwood Police Precinct, a sterile concrete garage where prisoners were transferred, Hess turned in his seat. "My body cam must have been acting up," he said to Ramirez, his voice casual, almost an afterthought. "The battery light was blinking the whole time. I'll have to write it up for IT. Probably didn't record the whole encounter." Ramirez's blood ran cold. It was the oldest trick in the book. A malfunction, a dead battery, a corrupted file. It was the convenient excuse used to explain away the absence of evidence that would contradict an officer's report. It was a lie so common, so transparent, that it had become a dark joke within the department. Hess wasn't even trying to be creative. He was invoking the unofficial policy of technological failure in the face of accountability. She knew his camera had been working. She had seen the small green light glowing on his chest when she arrived on the scene. She also knew that challenging him on it right now, in this moment, would be professional suicide. She would be branded a rat, an untrustworthy partner. Her career would be over. So she did what so many good officers do when faced with the bad actions of another. She said nothing. Her silence was its own form of complicity, a weight that would settle on her conscience for years to come. Inside the station, the process of booking was a study in dehumanization. Hess led Marcus to a central processing desk, his hand firmly on Marcus's cuffed arms. The desk sergeant, a burly, gray-haired veteran named Frank Miller, looked up from his paperwork, his expression one of weary resignation. He'd seen it all, and the sight of another arrest on a quiet Tuesday morning barely registered. "What do you got, Dean?" Miller asked, his voice a low gravel. "Mail theft," Hess announced with a hint of pride. Caught him in the act over on Chestnut. Got belligerent. Had to take him down. Miller grunted, taking the preliminary arrest form from Hess. His eyes scanned the details. Suspect's name? Marcus Thorne. Address: 412 Chestnut Drive. Offense location: 412 Chestnut Drive. Miller stopped reading. He looked up, his gaze moving from the paper to Marcus, then to Hess. He'd been a cop for 30 years. He knew that burglars didn't typically carry ID with the address of the house they were robbing. Mail thieves weren't usually arrested at the scene of the crime, which also happened to be their own home. Dean, Miller said slowly, tapping the paper. The arrest location and the suspect's home address are the same. Yeah, I know, Hess said, his tone defensive. He was probably using the house as a base of operations, or had a fake ID. We're still sorting it out. The explanation was so flimsy, so illogical, that it was almost insulting. Miller looked at Hess, a flicker of deep suspicion in his eyes. He knew Hess. He knew his reputation for being a hothead, for seeing every minor infraction as a personal affront. This whole arrest smelled wrong. It smelled like bad police work. But Miller was a sergeant, not an internal affairs investigator. His job was to process the arrest that was brought to him, not to second-guess the arresting officer on the floor. He could flag it, make a note, but challenging Hess directly would create a firestorm of paperwork and interdepartmental friction. He made a calculated decision. He would process the prisoner, but he would also watch this case very, very closely. Marcus's belongings were cataloged: a set of house keys, a crumpled tissue, and the $23 in his wallet. He was fingerprinted, the cold, greasy ink a further mark of his new identity as a criminal. He was told to stand against a wall for his mugshot, the bright flash of the camera immortalizing his lowest moment. Through it all, he remained silent, a cold, hard knot of resolve forming in his chest. They could take his freedom, his dignity, his name, but they couldn't take his mind. And as he was led toward a holding cell, his mind was working, remembering a conversation he'd had with his mother years ago, a conversation that now seemed chillingly prophetic. Sergeant Frank Miller watched as Marcus Thorne was led away toward the holding cells. The precinct was a river of human misery, and Miller had spent 3 decades standing on its banks, watching the currents of crime and consequence flow past. He was an expert at reading the debris that washed up at his desk, the sullen teenagers caught with weed, the desperate shoplifters, the angry spouses cooling off after a domestic dispute. But the case of Marcus Thorne was a piece of driftwood that didn't fit the pattern. It felt jagged, out of place. He picked up Hess's preliminary report again. It was a masterclass in ambiguity and subjective language. Phrases like furtive movements, evasive answers, and aggressive posture littered the page. These were catch-all terms, impossible to disprove, that painted a picture of a dangerous encounter. But the report was conspicuously thin on objective facts. It mentioned the mail, but failed to state that the name and address on the mail matched the suspect and the location. It detailed Marcus's failure to comply, but omitted the fact that his ID was inside his own home. It was a narrative constructed to lead to one and only one conclusion: that the arrest was justified. Miller looked over at Hess, who was now at a computer terminal, typing up the full incident report, his back to the rest of the room. He was a closed loop, a man who tolerated no dissent, no questioning of his authority. Miller had seen cops like him before. They were often lauded for being proactive and for their high arrest numbers, but they were also liabilities, emotional landmines waiting to be stepped on. They saw defiance in a simple question and danger in a person of color existing in a white space. They didn't solve problems. They created them, leaving others to clean up the mess. His phone rang, a welcome distraction. It was the city prosecutor's office, a junior ADA calling about a different case. As Miller discussed the details of a recent burglary, his eyes kept drifting back to the file on his desk. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply, fundamentally wrong. A cop's gut is a powerful thing, an instinct developed over thousands of human interactions. And Miller's gut was screaming at him that Officer Dean Hess had just made a terrible mistake. He finished his call and walked over to the evidence locker. He signed out the bag containing the contents of Marcus Thorne's pockets and the mail Hess had collected. He laid the items out on a clean counter, the house keys, the wallet. He opened the wallet. Inside was a Northwood University alumni card, a few credit cards, an insurance card, and a crisp, state-issued driver's license. He picked up the license. The face in the photo was unmistakably the man now sitting in his holding cell. The name read Marcus Evelyn Thorne. The address, 412 Chestnut Drive, Cedar Creek. Miller then picked up the electric bill from the evidence bag. The name on the bill, M. Thorne. The address, 412 Chestnut Drive. He stood there for a long moment, the two pieces of plastic and paper in his hands. This wasn't a sophisticated fake ID. This wasn't a clever criminal conspiracy. This was a man's identification and a man's utility bill, both confirming exactly what he had told Officer Hess from the very beginning. Miller felt a cold anger rise in his chest. This wasn't just a mistake. This was willful blindness. Hess hadn't just failed to investigate, he had actively chosen to ignore evidence that was, quite literally, in his hand. Miller walked back to his desk, the evidence still with him. He had a choice to make. He could follow protocol, file the paperwork, and let the justice system sort it out in a few days or weeks, by which time an innocent man would have a criminal record and a deep, abiding hatred for the police. Or he could push. He could step outside the normal chain of command and challenge the narrative that Hess was so carefully constructing. He decided to try the path of least resistance first. He walked over to Hess's workstation. "Dean," he said, his voice low and even. "I was just looking at the suspect's ID from his wallet. It matches the mail, same name, same address." He laid the license and the bill down on the desk next to Hess's keyboard, a silent, irrefutable counter-argument to the report Hess was writing. Hess stopped typing. He looked at the items for a second before pushing them away, a flicker of annoyance crossing his face. "I told you, Sarge. It's probably a fake. Or he's a squatter. The guy was a total punk, giving me lip from the second I stepped out of the car. He's dirty. My gut tells me." "Your gut," Miller thought with disgust. "Your gut is a prejudiced, arrogant liability." "His story is that it was his mother's house," Miller pressed, his voice still calm. "It's an easy thing to check, a quick property records search." "I don't have time to run a damn real estate seminar for every liar I arrest," Hess snapped, his voice rising. "I had probable cause based on his suspicious behavior and his refusal to cooperate. The arrest is solid. Are you saying I shouldn't have arrested him?" The challenge was direct, a classic defensive maneuver. He was forcing Miller to either formally accuse him of making a bad arrest or back down. To make that accusation would trigger a mountain of internal paperwork and pit a desk sergeant against a patrol officer who was backed by the union. It was a fight Miller wasn't sure he could win. "I'm just saying the evidence here seems to support his story," Miller said, retreating slightly. "And I'm saying the report will reflect what I saw on the scene," Hess said, his voice final. He turned back to his computer, a clear dismissal. The conversation was over. Miller stood there for a moment, the driver's license and the bill still on Hess's desk. He picked them up and walked back to his own station, defeated. He had tried. He had presented the evidence. And he had been stonewalled by a fellow officer's toxic combination of arrogance and denial. He had done his job, but he knew it wasn't enough. He bagged the evidence, his movements slow and deliberate. He had a sinking feeling that this file, this arrest of Marcus Thorne on a quiet Tuesday morning, was going to explode. And when it did, he wanted to be sure he was standing well clear of the blast radius. The holding cell was a small concrete box, painted a depressing institutional gray. It contained only a steel bench and a toilet, and it smelled faintly of disinfectant and despair. Marcus sat on the bench, the chill of the metal seeping through his shorts. For the first hour he had been numb, his mind a whirlwind of shock and fury. But as the adrenaline faded, it was replaced by a cold, clear resolve. Panic was a luxury he couldn't afford. Despair was a trap. He needed to think. His mind went back to his mother, Evelyn Thorne. She had been a force of nature, a brilliant and fiercely dedicated civil rights attorney who had spent 40 years fighting battles just like this one in courtrooms across the country. She had seen the very worst of the system, the way it could chew up and spit out innocent people, particularly innocent black people. She was a pragmatist, not an idealist. She believed in the law, but she had no illusions about the people who enforced it. He remembered a conversation they'd had around the kitchen table a few years before she died. He had been telling her about a friend who had been pulled over and harassed by the police for no reason. He had been angry, indignant. His mother had listened patiently, her expression serious. "Anger is good, Marcus," she had told him, her voice calm and steady. "It means you haven't gone numb. But anger alone won't protect you. You need a plan. The world is what it is, and you have to be prepared for the day it decides to come for you." That day, she had laid out her plan for him and his sister Lena. It was a set of protocols, a list of things to do if either of them ever found themselves in a situation like this. It had seemed overly dramatic at the time, a relic of a bygone era of civil rights struggles. Marcus, with his successful career and his comfortable life, had never truly believed he would need it. Now, sitting in a holding cell, her words felt like a lifeline thrown across time. Rule number 1 was simple: survive the encounter. Don't argue, don't resist physically, just say what you need to say to stay alive. He had done that. Rule number 2, say as little as possible to the police after the arrest. Don't try to explain or justify, just ask for a lawyer. He was waiting for his chance to do that. Rule number 3 was the most important. The first phone call you make is not to a lawyer, not to a bail bondsman. It's to family. And there was a specific message. When the guard finally came to take him to the phone, Marcus's heart was pounding, but his mind was clear. He was allowed one phone call. He dialed his sister Lena's number from memory. She was supposed to be hiking in the Rockies, but he prayed she had cell service. She answered on the third ring, her voice bright and cheerful. "Hey, big brother! You would not believe the view from up here. It's—" "Lena, listen to me very carefully," Marcus interrupted, his voice low and urgent. "I'm at the Northwood precinct. I've been arrested." The cheerful energy in her voice vanished, replaced by cold dread. "What? Marcus, what are you talking about? What happened?" "There's no time to explain," he said, acutely aware that the guard was standing just a few feet away, listening to every word. "Just listen. Do you remember what Mom told us? It's time. Activate the protocol." There was a moment of stunned silence on the other end of the line. Activate the protocol. It was the code phrase their mother had invented, the trigger for the entire plan. Lena was a graphic designer, a creative and sometimes scattered soul, but their mother had drilled this into them. She knew exactly what it meant. "Oh my God, Marcus," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Are you okay? Did they hurt you?" "I'm okay. Just do it, Lena. Do it now. And then call Julian Croft. You have his number." "I'm on it," she said, her voice suddenly firm, the fear replaced by the same steely resolve that had defined their mother. "I'll get you out of there, Marcus. I promise." The line went dead. Marcus handed the phone back to the guard and was led back to his cell. He had done his part. Now he had to trust in the plan his mother had laid for him, a plan born from a lifetime of fighting against the darkness. Miles away, in a small cabin in the Colorado mountains, Lena Thorne's vacation was over. She immediately ended her call and opened her laptop. Her fingers flew across the keyboard. She logged into the security system of their mother's house, the one Evelyn had insisted on installing a few years back. It wasn't a standard system from a big-name company. It was a commercial-grade, high-definition setup with multiple cameras, cloud storage, and its own dedicated power backup. Evelyn had called it her insurance policy against convenient malfunctions. Lena navigated to the feed for the front porch camera. She scrolled back the timeline to 8:17 a.m., and there it was. The entire encounter, captured in crystal-clear 4K resolution. The audio was crisp, picked up by a sensitive microphone hidden in a porch light fixture. She saw Marcus checking the mail. She saw Officer Hess arrive, heard his aggressive questioning. She heard Marcus calmly explain that he lived there, saw him hold up the mail. She watched in horror as Hess escalated the situation, as he lied to his partner, and as he threw her brother to the ground. She saw it all. The unblinking eye of her mother's camera had missed nothing. With tears of rage and fear streaming down her face, she began the download. It was a large file, but the cabin had a decent internet connection. As the progress bar crept across the screen, she picked up her phone again and dialed the number for Julian Croft, her mother's oldest friend, and one of the most feared civil rights attorneys in the country. The plan was in motion. The legacy of Evelyn Thorne was about to be unleashed. Julian Croft was in his late 60s, a man whose sharp suits and silver hair couldn't quite conceal the spirit of the street-fighting activist he had been in his youth. His office on the top floor of a downtown skyscraper was a testament to a career spent forcing institutions to reckon with their sins. When Lena Thorne's name flashed on his phone, he answered immediately. He had known Lena and Marcus since they were children. He had been Evelyn's partner in the trenches, her confidant and her friend. He listened without interruption as Lena, her voice shaking but resolute, recounted what Marcus had told her and what she was now witnessing on the downloaded video file. He didn't register shock or surprise. What he felt was a deep, familiar sadness and a slow, burning anger. It was the same story he had been hearing for 40 years, just with new names and new faces. "Send me the file, Lena," he said, his voice a calm, commanding rumble. "Don't post it anywhere. Don't send it to anyone else. Just send it to me. And then, I want you to get on the first flight home. Your brother is going to need you." While the large video file was uploading to Croft's secure server, Lena did something her mother's protocol hadn't explicitly covered, but which her own modern instincts told her was necessary. She edited a short 1-minute clip of the video. She chose the most damning moments. Hess's initial aggressive approach, Marcus clearly showing the mail with his address, and the violent takedown on the lawn. She stripped out the audio to avoid any potential wiretapping legal claims, letting the stark, silent images speak for themselves. Then, with a deep breath, she uploaded the clip to Twitter, tagging the local news outlets, the mayor's office, and the Northwood Police Department's official account. She added a simple, powerful caption. "This is my brother, Marcus Thorne. He was arrested this morning for checking the mail at our mother's house. Badge number 315. Hashtag Justice for Marcus." The internet moves at the speed of outrage. The clip landed like a spark in a tinderbox. At first, it was just a few retweets, then a dozen, then 100. A local activist with a large following saw it and shared it. A journalist from the city's biggest newspaper saw that post and retweeted it. Within an hour, it had thousands of views. By lunchtime, it was tens of thousands. The silent, high-definition footage was brutal in its clarity. There was no ambiguity, no room for interpretation. It showed a calm, unarmed man being assaulted by a police officer for no discernible reason. The badge number, 315, was clearly visible on Hess's sleeve. Back at the Northwood precinct, Officer Dean Hess was finishing his report. He felt a sense of satisfaction, of a job well done. He had documented the facts meticulously, creating a paper trail that completely supported his actions. He described Marcus's pre-assault indicators and his active resistance. He noted the fortunate recovery of the stolen mail. He officially logged his body camera for maintenance due to a power cycle malfunction, ensuring a plausible reason for the lack of footage. He had covered all his bases. He was, he believed, untouchable. Sergeant Miller, meanwhile, had quietly alerted his shift lieutenant about the inconsistencies in the arrest, but was told to stand down and let the process work. The lieutenant didn't want the headache of questioning an arresting officer's report without a formal complaint. The system was functioning as designed. It was protecting its own. The first sign that their controlled internal world had been breached came around 2 p.m. The precinct's front desk started getting calls. At first, it was just a trickle. "I'm calling about the video of the man being arrested on his lawn. What are you going to do about Officer 315? The desk officer, confused, had no idea what they were talking about. Then the trickle became a flood. The station's phone lines lit up. The police chief's office was getting calls. The mayor's office was getting calls. The local news stations, having been tagged in the viral tweet, started dispatching reporters to the precinct. The department's public information officer, a harried-looking man named Lieutenant Jennings, saw the tweet and felt a wave of nausea. He immediately went to the chief's office. Chief Robert Davis, a political appointee with carefully managed public image, was on the phone with the mayor. His face was grim. "I'm looking at it now, Mr. Mayor," Davis said, his eyes glued to the video playing on his computer screen. "No, I don't have any information yet. I haven't even seen the arrest report." He hung up the phone and looked at Jennings. "What the hell is this? Who the hell is Officer Hess?" The fortress had been breached. The carefully constructed walls of reports, protocols, and the blue line of silence had been rendered meaningless by a single, perfectly clear video from a camera on a porch. The unblinking eye of Evelyn Thorne's foresight had exposed the truth in a way no internal complaint ever could. The official narrative that Hess had so carefully crafted was incinerated in the harsh, unforgiving light of a viral video. The story no longer belonged to the Northwood Police Department. It now belonged to the public, and the public was demanding answers. The atmosphere inside the Northwood Police Department's command staff offices went from routine to frantic in less than an hour. Chief Davis, a man who prided himself on running a tight ship, felt the floor drop out from under him. The viral video was a communications nightmare, a perfect storm of bad optics and worse reality. He had the mayor screaming in one ear and every news outlet in the city blowing up his public information officer's phone. "Get me the report on this Thorne arrest now," Davis barked at his aide. "And get Officer Dean Hess and his partner in my office 10 minutes ago." While he waited, he watched the video again, this time with the department's legal counsel, a cautious, meticulous woman named Sarah Jenkins. She watched the silent clip with a stony expression, her legal mind dissecting every frame. "This is catastrophic, Chief," she said when it finished. "From a civil liability standpoint, this is a blank check. The takedown is completely indefensible. There's no visible provocation, no attempt to flee. The suspect is calm and then he's on the ground. A jury will eat us alive." "What about the officer's report?" Davis asked, a desperate hope in his voice. "Maybe there's context we're missing." "There is no context that will make that video look good," Jenkins stated flatly. "Unless the suspect had a weapon we can't see or made a direct verbal threat, our officer is exposed, and so is the department for failure to train and supervise." The arrest report arrived. Davis read it, his face growing darker with every sentence. Hess's narrative of a belligerent and evasive suspect was a work of pure fiction when contrasted with the man in the video. The report was an obvious, clumsy attempt at a cover-up, and the final nail in the coffin was the addendum about the malfunctioning body camera. "He's claiming his body cam failed?" Jenkins asked with a sigh of disgust. "Of course he is. No jury in the country will believe that's a coincidence." When Hess and Ramirez were finally escorted into the chief's office, the tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. Hess, still blissfully unaware of the viral video, walked in with a confident swagger. He assumed he was being called in for a commendation on a good arrest. Ramirez, on the other hand, looked pale and nervous. She knew this couldn't be good. "Officer Hess," Chief Davis began, his voice dangerously calm. "Walk me through your arrest of Marcus Thorne this morning." Hess launched into his prepared speech, reciting the details from his report with practiced confidence. He painted a picture of a tense, escalating encounter where he was forced to use minimal force to subdue a non-compliant individual. When he was finished, Davis simply turned his computer monitor around for Hess to see. The video was paused on the frame of Hess with his knee in Marcus's back. Hess stared at the screen, The color drained from his face. His confident posture dissolved, his shoulders slumping as the reality of his situation crashed down on him. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. "Your body camera, Officer Hess," Davis continued, his voice like ice. "The report says it malfunctioned. Is that what you're sticking with?" Hess stammered. The battery light was blinking, Chief. I thought—" "Don't think," Davis snapped. "Just answer the question. Is there footage of this arrest from your department-issued camera?" "No, sir," Hess mumbled, his eyes glued to the floor. Davis turned his attention to Ramirez. "Officer Ramirez, you were on the scene. Is Officer Hess's report an accurate description of the events as you witnessed them?" This was the moment Ramirez had been dreading. She looked at her partner, a man she had trusted with her life, now exposed as a liar and a brute. She looked at her chief, whose face was a mask of cold fury. She could lie, back her partner's play, and hope the storm blew over. Or she could tell the truth and detonate her own career. In the silence of that office, with two powerful men staring at her, she made her choice. "No, Chief," she said, her voice barely a whisper but clear and steady. "It is not." The dam broke. While Hess was placed on immediate administrative leave and ordered to surrender his badge and weapon, the department's PR machine went into a clumsy, reactive damage control mode. Lieutenant Jennings was sent out to face the scrum of reporters who had now gathered outside the precinct. He delivered the standard, infuriatingly vague statement. "The Northwood Police Department is aware of a video circulating on social media involving one of our officers. We take all allegations of misconduct seriously. The officer involved has been placed on administrative leave pending a full and thorough internal investigation." The statement was meant to placate, to buy time. It did the opposite. To a public that had already seen the clear evidence of the video, the non-committal, bureaucratic language was an insult. They didn't want an investigation. They wanted accountability. They wanted Hess fired. They wanted Marcus Thorne released and exonerated. The hashtag #Justice for Marcus was now trending nationally. Protesters began to organize online, planning a rally outside the precinct for the following day. The department's clumsy attempt to control the narrative had failed spectacularly. They had lost the public trust in a matter of hours. Inside the precinct, morale plummeted. Good cops were furious that Hess's actions had tainted them all. Bad cops were nervous, wondering which of their own past actions might one day be exposed by a ubiquitous security camera. The crisis was no longer just about one bad arrest. It was about the culture of the entire department, a culture that had allowed an officer like Dean Hess to operate with impunity until the unblinking eye of a camera made it impossible to ignore. While the police department was descending into chaos, Julian Croft was moving with the calm, deliberate precision of a master strategist. He had the full, unedited video file from Lena, and it was even more damning than the short clip that had gone viral. The high-fidelity audio captured every word. Hess's baseless accusations, Marcus's calm, reasonable replies, and Hess's lies to his partner. It was a prosecutor's dream and a defense attorney's nightmare. His first call was to the district attorney's office. He spoke with DA Helen Morgan, a woman he had known and occasionally battled in court for over 20 years. "Helen," he said, his tone leaving no room for pleasantries, "it's Julian Croft. I trust you've seen the video of the Marcus Thorne arrest in Northwood." "I have," she confirmed, her voice weary. "It's a disaster." "It's more than a disaster, Helen. It's a felony. It's assault under color of law, false imprisonment, and a litany of civil rights violations. I'm representing Mr. Thorne. He is an innocent man who is currently illegally being held in your city's jail. I expect him to be released and all charges dropped within the hour. If he is not, the first lawsuit I file on Monday morning will name you personally for malicious prosecution." The threat was not idle. Croft had a reputation for fighting with scorched earth intensity. Morgan knew that he had the evidence to back it up. "I'm already looking into it, Julian," she said. "Give me an hour." His next step was to formally notify the city of his intent to sue. He drafted a letter addressed to the mayor, the city attorney, and police chief Davis. It was a legal broadside, outlining in stark detail the constitutional violations committed against his client. It mentioned the Fourth Amendment violation against unreasonable seizure, the 14th Amendment violation of due process, and it laid the groundwork for a massive civil suit that would seek damages for false arrest, assault and battery, emotional distress, and negligent training and supervision by the police department. He sent a letter via courier, ensuring it would arrive on their desks before the end of the business day, a clear signal that the fight was just beginning. Finally, he drove to the Northwood precinct himself. He walked through the crowd of reporters and into the station, his expensive suit and leather briefcase parting the sea of chaos like a ship's bow through water. He didn't stop at the front desk. He walked directly to Sergeant Miller's station, having gotten his name from a source inside the department. "Sergeant Miller," he said, extending a hand. "Julian Croft. I'm Marcus Thorne's attorney. I'm here to see my client." Miller, who had been dreading this moment all day, looked relieved. Finally, someone with real power had arrived. "Of course, Mr. Croft," he said, standing immediately. "This way." The reunion between Croft and Marcus in a small, sterile attorney-client meeting room was somber. Croft's heart ached seeing Evelyn's son, a man he had known since he was a boy, sitting in a drab jumpsuit, looking exhausted but unbroken. "Julian," Marcus said, a wave of immense relief washing over him. "Thank you for coming." "There's nowhere else I'd be, son," Croft said, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Your mother would be so proud of you. You handled yourself perfectly." He then quickly briefed Marcus on the situation. The video had gone viral. The DA was dropping the charges, and a massive lawsuit was imminent. "First things first, we're getting you out of here," Croft explained. "The DA has already agreed to an ROR, release on your own recognizance, but I told her that's not good enough. We want a full dismissal and an apology. We're not accepting anything that implies for even a second that there was a legitimate reason for this arrest." As they spoke, the gears of the city's bureaucracy were slowly, painfully grinding in the direction of justice. Under immense pressure from the DA and the mayor's office, Chief Davis signed the order to drop all charges against Marcus Thorne. At 5:30 p.m., less than 10 hours after he was thrown to the ground on his own lawn, Marcus Thorne walked out the front doors of the Northwood precinct a free man. He was flanked by Julian Croft and his sister Lena, who had landed an hour before and come straight to the station. A chaotic barrage of flashing cameras and shouted questions from the assembled media greeted them. Marcus, looking tired but resolute, stepped up to the microphones Croft's paralegal had set up. He had not wanted to speak, but Croft had insisted it was important. "This morning I was arrested for being a black man in my own front yard," Marcus began, his voice clear and strong, carrying over the media scrum. "The officer who arrested me ignored evidence, lied to his partner, and used violence when I was calm and cooperative. What happened to me was not just the actions of one bad officer. It was the result of a system that allows prejudice to exist and go unchecked. I am fortunate. I am fortunate to have a mother who taught me what to do, to have the resources to fight back. But this isn't just about me. This is for every single person who does not have a security camera, who does not have a powerful lawyer, whose story is never heard. This ends now." His words, broadcast live on the evening news, were a declaration of war. He was no longer just a victim. He was now a plaintiff, the lead figure in a legal battle that would challenge the very foundations of the Northwood Police Department. The arrival of Julian Croft had transformed a personal trauma into a public crusade. The morning after Marcus Thorne's release, the Northwood Police Department's Internal Affairs Division officially opened case file number IA 2025-047. The investigation into the conduct of Officer Dean Hess was now underway. In theory, an IA investigation is an impartial search for the truth. In practice, it is often a tightly controlled process, a battle of wills fought between investigators, the accused officer, and the powerful police union that represents them. The lead investigator was Sergeant David Chen, a quiet, methodical detective with a reputation for being unshakable. His first scheduled interview was with the key witness, the person whose perspective could either corroborate or contradict the viral video, Officer Maria Ramirez. Ramirez hadn't slept. She had spent the night replaying the arrest in her mind, her brief, whispered words in the chief's office echoing in her ears. She knew that her testimony would effectively end her partner's career and mark her for life within the department. The blue wall of silence was a powerful, unwritten code, and she was about to take a sledgehammer to it. She sat across from Sergeant Chen in a small, windowless room. Her union representative, a grim-faced lawyer named Bill Donovan, sat beside her. "Officer Ramirez," Chen began, his voice calm and professional. "Please walk me through the events of yesterday morning, from the moment you arrived on scene at 412 Chestnut Drive." Guided by her lawyer's advice to stick to the objective facts, Ramirez recounted what she saw. She described arriving and observing Marcus Thorne standing calmly. She detailed seeing the mail on the ground, addressed to Thorne at that location. She repeated the words she had spoken to Hess, trying to point out the exculpatory evidence. "And how did Officer Hess respond to your observation about the mail?" Chen asked. "He told me to watch the suspect and that he would secure the scene," Ramirez said, her voice flat. "Did you at any point feel that that Mr. Thorne posed a threat to you or your partner?" "No," Ramirez said without hesitation. "He was compliant. His hands were visible. His demeanor was calm." "And the use of force, the takedown. In your professional opinion, was that level of force necessary to effect the arrest?" The union lawyer shifted in his seat, ready to object, but Ramirez answered before he could. "No," she said again, her voice firmer this time. "It was not." Her testimony was devastating. It was a direct contradiction of every key point in Hess's report, coming from his own partner. Chen knew this was the linchpin of the entire case. The investigators also brought in Mrs. Gable, the elderly neighbor who had watched the arrest from her window. She was nervous, intimidated by the formal setting of the police station, but her memory was sharp. "I saw the whole thing," she told Chen, her voice trembling slightly. "Marcus is a good boy, always so polite. He helps me with my trash cans every week. That officer, he was a bully. He yelled at Marcus, and then he just attacked him, threw him on the ground like a sack of potatoes. It was horrible. I've lived in this neighborhood for 40 years, and I've never seen anything like it." Her statement, coming from a long-time, uninvolved civilian resident, added another layer of irrefutable credibility to Marcus's story. The final piece was the interview with Dean Hess himself. He walked in with his own union-appointed attorney, a bulldog of a man named Ken Patterson, who specialized in defending police misconduct cases. Hess's attitude was no longer confident. It was defiant, sullen. He had been cast as the villain, and he was leaning into the role. Under Patterson's aggressive coaching, Hess stuck to his story, embellishing it with new details. He claimed Marcus had bladed his body into a pre-assaultive stance. He insisted he saw a bulge in Marcus's hoodie pocket that he believed could have been a weapon. He argued that the porch camera's angle was misleading and didn't capture the true menace of the encounter. "The video doesn't tell the whole story," Hess insisted, his voice dripping with self-pity and righteous anger. "You can't feel the tension. You can't know what's going through an officer's mind when he's facing down a potentially violent felon. I did what I was trained to do to protect myself and the community." Sergeant Chen listened patiently, his face betraying no emotion. He had seen this performance 100 times before. The accused officer, backed into a corner by incontrovertible evidence, creates an alternate reality, a universe of unseen threats and secret knowledge that only he was privy to. "Officer Hess," Chen said calmly when Hess was finished, "your partner, Officer Ramirez, testified that Mr. Thorne was calm and compliant. Your neighbor, Mrs. Gable, testified that your actions were unprovoked. The mail found at the scene confirmed Mr. Thorne's identity. The video shows no overt threat, and your body camera conveniently malfunctioned. How do you explain these discrepancies?" Hess's lawyer jumped in. "My client has given his statement, Sergeant. We have nothing further to add at this time." The interview was over, but the outcome was already clear. Hess's story was a house of cards, and the combined testimony of his partner, his neighbors, and the video evidence had just blown it down. The internal investigation was no longer about determining what happened. It was now about documenting the overwhelming evidence of misconduct in preparation for the inevitable termination hearing. Dean Hess was a cop on borrowed time. In the immediate aftermath of a high-profile incident, police unions typically close ranks with remarkable speed and solidarity. Their initial response to the Marcus Thorne arrest was no different. Ken Patterson, the union attorney representing Dean Hess, released a boilerplate statement urging the public to avoid a rush to judgment and to remember that a short video clip rarely tells the full story. The union's president spoke on a local radio show about the dangers officers face daily and the split-second decisions they must make. It was a well-rehearsed defense, designed to protect the officer and the institution of policing itself. But the Marcus Thorne case was different. The evidence wasn't a grainy, ambiguous cell phone video from a bystander. It was a high-definition, stable, and irrefutable recording, supplemented by audio that was just as clear. And the union leadership knew it. Behind closed doors, the mood was grim. Patterson met with Hess to review the evidence and prepare for the internal affairs interview. He had seen the full, unedited video from Julian Croft's office, provided as part of the initial legal filings. "Dean, I'm going to be blunt with you," Patterson said, leaning across the table in his cluttered office. "This is bad. The video is indefensible. The audio is worse. Your partner is not backing your story. You have an elderly neighbor who is a perfect witness for the prosecution. You have a victim with zero criminal history and the son of a legal legend. And you have a malfunctioning body camera. This is a perfect storm of shit, and you are standing right in the middle of it." Hess, who had been expecting his union lawyer to devise a clever strategy to make this all go away, was stunned by the blunt assessment. "So what do we do?" he asked, his voice small. "What we do is we try to save your job and keep you out of prison," Patterson said. "Your only play here is to argue that you made a mistake in good faith, that you misinterpreted the situation based on your training and experience. We argue that you were overzealous, not malicious. We show remorse. We apologize. Maybe we can negotiate a lengthy suspension instead of termination." But Hess was incapable of showing remorse because he didn't feel any. In his mind, he was the victim. He had been publicly shamed. His career was on the line, all because he had tried to do his job. "I'm not apologizing," Hess said, his jaw set stubbornly. "I didn't do anything wrong. That guy was antagonizing me from the start." Patterson sighed. He had seen this before. The officer whose pride and arrogance made it impossible for him to accept reality, turning a salvageable situation into a complete catastrophe. "Dean, if you go into that IA interview and stick to that story, they're not just going to fire you. They're going to hand the entire case file with a bow on it to the district attorney for criminal prosecution. Your defiance will be Exhibit A." The union's public support began to fracture under the immense weight of the evidence and the mounting public pressure. Rank-and-file officers, who initially might have sympathized with Hess, saw the video and felt a sense of embarrassment and anger. Hess's sloppy, prejudiced police work made them all look bad. It made their jobs harder, sowing more distrust in a community they were trying to serve. The union president, who had so staunchly defended Hess on the radio, began to hedge his statements. In a new interview, he said, "The union is committed to ensuring every officer receives due process. However, we also believe in accountability. If the investigation finds that this officer violated policy and the law, we will respect that outcome." It was a clear signal. They were cutting Hess loose. The blue wall of silence was crumbling because the evidence was just too loud to ignore. Hess was becoming an island. His friends on the force stopped calling. Officers who used to greet him in the hallway now avoided eye contact. He was a pariah, a walking symbol of a scandal the department was desperate to put behind it. His isolation fueled his paranoia and his sense of victimhood. The world was against him. Everyone had betrayed him, his partner, his sergeant, his chief, and now his own union. The financial pressure began to mount. Suspended without pay, he watched as his savings dwindled. His wife, a dental hygienist named Karen, was facing questions from her coworkers and patients. Their quiet, comfortable suburban life was unraveling. The stress led to bitter, escalating arguments. "Why can't you just admit you made a mistake?" Karen pleaded with him one night, her voice raw with exhaustion. "Maybe if you just apologized, this could all be over." "Apologize for what?" he shot back, his voice rising. "For doing my job? For trying to keep our neighborhood safe? I'm the one being crucified here, and you want me to apologize?" The conversation ended, like so many others, in a stony, resentful silence. Dean Hess was losing everything: his career, the respect of his peers, and now his family. And he couldn't understand why. He was so blinded by his own narrative of grievance that he couldn't see the simple, devastating truth. This was a disaster entirely of his own making. He was not the victim of a conspiracy. He was the architect of his own downfall. As the legal proceedings against Dean Hess ground forward, the media began to dig deeper into the background of the man at the center of the storm, Marcus Thorne. He had given his one powerful statement on the steps of the precinct and had since retreated from the public eye, leaving the legal fight to Julian Croft. But the press was insatiable, and a talented investigative reporter from the Cedar Creek Chronicle named Sarah Kaplan started pulling at the threads of his family history. She started with public records. A property search on 412 Chestnut Drive listed the previous owner, Evelyn Thorne. A quick search of that name in legal archives opened up a treasure trove. Evelyn Thorne wasn't just any lawyer. She was a legend, a pioneer, a civil rights icon who had argued landmark cases against housing discrimination, voter suppression, and, most notably, police misconduct. Kaplan's article, published on the front page of the Sunday paper, was a bombshell. The headline read, "Son of civil rights legend arrested on her own doorstep." The story was a powerful, poignant exploration of the bitter irony that had been hiding in plain sight. It detailed Evelyn Thorne's most famous cases, including a class-action lawsuit from the 1990s against a neighboring police department for its unconstitutional stop and frisk policies. The article quoted passages from her legal briefs, her words echoing across the decades with chilling relevance. "A police officer's suspicion cannot be a pretext for his prejudice," Evelyn had written in one motion. "When we allow law enforcement to operate on the basis of gut feelings about who belongs in a neighborhood and who does not, we are not creating safety. We are creating a system of arbitrary harassment where the color of a person's skin is treated as probable cause." The article transformed the public's understanding of the case. This was no longer just a story about one man's wrongful arrest. It was a story about history, legacy, and the cyclical nature of injustice. Marcus wasn't just an accountant who had been in the wrong place at the wrong time. He was the son of a warrior, now fighting the very same dragon his mother had spent her life trying to slay. The revelation sent shockwaves through the community. The older residents of Cedar Creek remembered Evelyn Thorne not just as a legal titan, but as a neighbor and a friend. She had been the head of the neighborhood watch, a fixture at town hall meetings, a woman who commanded immense respect. The idea that her son could be brutalized on the lawn of her home was a deep, personal insult to the entire community. For Marcus, the article was both a source of pride and a heavy burden. He saw his mother's face on the front page of the newspaper and felt a profound sense of loss, wishing she were there to guide him. He reread her legal writings, her words now feeling less like history and more like a manual for his own survival. Julian Croft used the revelation to his strategic advantage. He released a new statement to the press. "Evelyn Thorne taught me everything I know about fighting for justice," the statement read. "She knew that the fight for civil rights is never truly over. It must be fought again and again by each new generation. The fact that her own son was subjected to the very abuse she dedicated her life to eradicating is a tragic indictment of how little progress has been made. But let me be clear. We will use this case to honor her legacy and to demand the real systemic changes she always fought for. The story of Evelyn Thorne gave the national media a powerful new angle. Marcus's case became a symbol of a larger, intergenerational struggle. Television news programs ran segments contrasting photos of a young, fiery Evelyn arguing on courthouse steps with the silent, damning video of her son being handcuffed on his lawn. This new focus was deeply uncomfortable for the Northwood Police Department and the city government. They were no longer just dealing with a standard police misconduct case. They were now on the wrong side of a story that pitted them against the legacy of a beloved American hero. The pressure to not only discipline Hess, but to enact meaningful, sweeping reforms became immense. The echo of Evelyn Thorne's fight had become a roar that they could no longer ignore. Her life's work, it turned out, had not ended with her death. It was continuing through the unwilling but determined activism of her son. In the court of public opinion, Marcus Thorne was a hero. He was a symbol of dignity in the face of injustice, a man who had stood up to a corrupt system and, with the help of his mother's foresight, exposed the truth. Donations poured into a legal defense fund that Julian Croft had set up. Messages of support flooded his social media. He had become an unwilling celebrity, the face of a movement. But in the sterile, risk-averse world of corporate America, he was something else entirely, a liability. Marcus was a senior financial analyst at a large, publicly traded tech firm called Syntech Solutions. He had been with the company for over a decade, a loyal and high-performing employee who had steadily climbed the corporate ladder. He loved his job, the order and logic of the numbers, the challenge of finding efficiencies in complex systems. It was a world away from the chaos and injustice that had recently engulfed his life. He believed that once the charges were dropped and his name was cleared, he could return to that world. He was wrong. 2 weeks after his arrest, he received an email from the company's head of human resources, scheduling a mandatory meeting. He walked into the glass-walled conference room with a sense of unease. Seated at the large mahogany table were the HR director and the company's chief legal counsel. The HR director, a woman who had always been friendly to him in the past, began with a series of cold, corporate platitudes. "Marcus, first and foremost, we were all very concerned to hear about your recent ordeal, and we're relieved that the situation has been resolved." Then came the pivot. "However," she continued, her tone shifting, "the company has to consider the significant media attention this incident has generated. Your name and face are now inextricably linked to a very public and contentious situation." The company lawyer took over. "Syntech has a number of sensitive government contracts, Marcus. We have a duty to our shareholders to avoid any and all controversy. The ongoing nature of your civil suit against the city means that this story will remain in the headlines for the foreseeable future. It has become a distraction." Marcus felt a cold dread creep up his spine. He knew where this was going. "A distraction," he repeated, his voice barely a whisper. "I was the victim of a crime. I was assaulted and falsely arrested. How am I the distraction?" "It's not about guilt or innocence, Marcus," the HR director said, her voice laced with false sympathy. "This is a business decision. The board feels that your continued employment represents an unacceptable level of reputational risk for the company." And that was it. He was being fired. Not for poor performance, not for any wrongdoing. He was being fired for being the victim of a high-profile injustice. The company that had once lauded him for his loyalty was now cutting him loose to protect its brand. They offered him a generous severance package, contingent on him signing a non-disclosure agreement that would prevent him from ever speaking publicly about his termination. He walked out of the building in a daze, carrying a cardboard box filled with the remnants of his 10-year career. The humiliation of the arrest had been public and brutal. This was something different. It was a quiet, cold, and calculated betrayal. It was a profound and painful lesson. Even when you are completely innocent, you can still be punished. The system that had failed to protect him on the street was now failing him in the boardroom. The news was a devastating blow, not just financially, but psychologically. His job had been his anchor, the piece of his old life that he thought he could hold on to. Now that was gone too. He had millions of dollars coming to him from a potential lawsuit, but he had lost his career, his sense of purpose, and his professional identity. When he told Julian Croft, the old lawyer's face hardened with a familiar rage. "This is what they do," Croft said, his voice a low growl. "They punish the victim for speaking out. They want you to be quiet, to be invisible. They can't fire you for being black, and they can't fire you for being arrested, so they fire you for being a distraction." Croft explained that they could file another lawsuit, this one for wrongful termination, but it would be a difficult uphill battle. The company had deep pockets and would argue that as an at-will employee, they could terminate him for any reason that wasn't explicitly discriminatory. Proving that his firing was a direct result of his race or his status as a victim of police brutality would be challenging. Marcus, exhausted by the fight he was already in, decided against it. He signed the papers, took the severance, and walked away. The price of his innocence, he was learning, was far higher than he ever could have imagined. He had won his freedom, but he had lost the quiet, normal life he had worked so hard to build. The victory against Officer Hess felt increasingly hollow, a single battle won in a much larger, more insidious war. With Marcus's professional life in shambles, Julian Croft accelerated the pressure on the city. The civil lawsuit he filed was a masterwork of legal aggression. It named not only Dean Hess as a defendant, but also Police Chief Robert Davis and the city of Northwood itself. Croft's legal theory was clear and compelling. This was not just about one rogue cop, it was about a systemic failure. The lawsuit alleged that the city had a pattern and practice of failing to properly train its officers on implicit bias and de-escalation. It claimed the department's supervision was so negligent that it allowed an officer with Hess's temperament to remain on the streets. And it argued that the city's consistent failure to discipline officers for misconduct had created a culture of impunity that made the assault on Marcus Thorne not just possible, but inevitable. The discovery process was a nightmare for the city. Croft's legal team deposed dozens of officers, including Sergeant Miller, whose testimony about Hess's dismissive attitude was particularly damning. They subpoenaed years of personnel files, revealing 2 prior complaints against Hess for aggressive behavior during traffic stops involving minority drivers, complaints that had been dismissed with a simple slap on the wrist. They uncovered training records showing that the department's implicit bias training consisted of a single 2-hour online video that officers were required to watch once every 3 years. The city's attorneys knew they were in an impossible position. The evidence against them was overwhelming. Julian Croft was a far more skilled and aggressive litigator than anyone on their team. And the central piece of evidence, the crystal-clear video of the arrest, was an emotional powerhouse that would sway any jury. Taking the case to trial would be a public relations bloodbath, and the potential damages awarded by a sympathetic jury could be financially ruinous. Negotiations began in secret. The city's initial offer was insultingly low. Croft didn't even counter, he simply laughed and hung up the phone. He knew he had all the leverage. As the months wore on and the legal bills mounted, the city's offers grew progressively larger. Finally, 6 months after the arrest, they reached a settlement. The city of Northwood agreed to pay Marcus Thorne $8.5 million, one of the largest settlements for a non-fatal police misconduct case in the state's history. But for Croft and Marcus, the money was only part of the victory. The settlement also included a series of non-economic terms that were legally binding. The city agreed to completely overhaul its police training program with a new curriculum focused on constitutional policing and bias awareness, to be developed in consultation with a civil rights organization of Marcus's choosing. They agreed to implement a new, more robust early warning system to identify and retrain officers who receive multiple citizen complaints. And they agreed to reform the internal affairs process to include a civilian oversight board. The settlement was a monumental victory, a clear admission of systemic failure by the city. It was a chance to create lasting change, a fitting tribute to the legacy of Evelyn Thorne. On the same day the settlement was announced, District Attorney Helen Morgan held a press conference. The criminal investigation into Dean Hess, which had been proceeding slowly in the background, was complete. A grand jury had reviewed the evidence, including the testimony of Officer Ramirez and the damning video, and had returned an indictment. Today, my office is filing a 3-count felony indictment against former Northwood police officer Dean Hess, Morgan announced, the cameras flashing. He is being charged with deprivation of rights under color of law, felony assault, and filing a false police report. Let this be a clear message. The badge is not a shield. No one is above the law. The news of the indictment sent a shockwave through the law enforcement community. While civil settlements were common, it was exceedingly rare for an officer to face serious felony charges for on-duty actions. The fact that a prosecutor was willing to take that step was a testament to the undeniable strength of the evidence. For Dean Hess, the world had completely collapsed. His termination from the police department had been finalized a month earlier. His wife had filed for divorce. And now, he was no longer just an unemployed, disgraced ex-cop. He was a criminal defendant, facing the very real possibility of a lengthy prison sentence. The legal system he had once weaponized against an innocent man was now turning its full, formidable power against him. The reckoning had arrived. The wheels of criminal justice turned slowly, and for nearly a year, Dean Hess's case crawled through the court system. His attorney filed a flurry of motions to have the charges dismissed, to have the video evidence suppressed, but each was denied by the judge. The evidence was simply too strong. A trial seemed inevitable. A conviction, likely. But the vast majority of criminal cases don't end in a dramatic courtroom trial. They end quietly, in a back room, with a deal. Facing the overwhelming evidence and the prospect of a long prison sentence if convicted at trial, Hess's defiance finally broke. He agreed to a plea bargain. He would plead guilty to a single felony count of filing a false police report and a misdemeanor charge of assault. In exchange, the more serious charge of deprivation of rights would be dropped. The sentence recommended by the prosecutor was 3 years of probation, mandatory anger management counseling, and the permanent forfeiture of his license to serve as a law enforcement officer anywhere in the state. He would avoid prison time. Marcus Thorne sat in the courtroom gallery and watched as Dean Hess, a man who had stolen his sense of safety and upended his life, stood before the judge and mumbled the word, guilty. There was no satisfaction in it. There was no sense of triumph. Marcus just felt tired. The man looked smaller now, stripped of his uniform and his authority. He was just a defeated, broken man who had ruined multiple lives, including his own, out of a toxic mix of prejudice and pride. The plea deal was the end of the legal road for Hess, but the story had one final, bitter twist. 3 months after his sentencing, a small local newspaper in a rural county 2 states away ran a short story in its community news section. The headline read, "Sheriff's Office welcomes new deputy." The article noted that the new hire, Dean Hess, was an experienced officer who had recently relocated to the area. The news was a gut punch to Marcus and Julian Croft. Hess had found a loophole. His law enforcement certification was revoked in their state, but that revocation didn't automatically transfer to every other state in the country. A small, underfunded sheriff's department, desperate for experienced officers and unwilling to conduct a thorough background check, had given him a second chance. They had given him back his badge and his gun. The system, in its final act, had revealed its deepest flaw: its inability to truly purge itself of its worst actors. Dean Hess was back on the street, ready to inflict his prejudices on a new, unsuspecting community. The news cemented a profound and painful truth for Marcus. He had won. He had received a massive settlement. He had forced departmental reform. He had a criminal conviction against the man who assaulted him. By any objective measure, he had achieved justice. But it felt hollow. His life was irrevocably changed. His career was gone. A constant low-level anxiety now followed him everywhere. And the man responsible was, unbelievably, still a cop. His victory was not a finish line. It was just one small, exhausting leg in a much longer relay race, a race his mother had run her entire life. The storm had passed. The lawsuits were settled. The criminal case was closed, and the news cycle had moved on to its next fleeting outrage. Marcus Thorne sat on his front porch in the same spot where his life had been torn apart over a year ago. The house was quiet. The settlement money sat in a trust, an enormous sum that felt more like a weight than a prize. He had won, but the victory had cost him his peace. He found himself replaying that morning, a constant loop of what-ifs running through his mind. What if he had just waited for the mail to be delivered to the door? What if he had immediately shown his ID without question, without asserting the rights his mother had taught him were his to claim? These questions were a form of self-torture, a search for a mistake he could blame on himself, because somehow that felt more manageable than the terrifying randomness of it all. But the truth was, his actions hadn't been the variable that mattered. The outcome of that morning was decided the moment Officer Hess laid eyes on him. The root of the disaster wasn't in what Marcus did, but in what Hess saw. A threat where there was only a neighbor, a criminal where there was only a son. Why? Perhaps Hess's own life was a tapestry of small failures and resentments, a feeling of powerlessness that he sought to remedy with the absolute authority of his badge. Maybe he saw in Marcus, a black man living in a handsome house in a neighborhood Hess could likely never afford, a symbol of a world that was leaving him behind. His prejudice wasn't just an abstract bias, it was a deeply personal grievance looking for a target. The tragedy is that for Marcus to have been safer, he would have had to have been smaller, more deferential, to have preemptively surrendered his dignity in the hope that it would appease an anger that was never truly about him. This story is a stark reminder that justice is not always a destination, but a relentless, often heartbreaking struggle. It teaches us that accountability is fragile, and the systems designed to protect us can be easily corrupted by the biases of the individuals within them. The real battle is not won in the courtroom with a settlement check, but in the difficult daily work of challenging our own assumptions and demanding a world where a man's right to exist in his own space is not subject to the prejudices of another. What do you believe true justice for Marcus Thorne would have looked like? If you were in his shoes, would you have felt that the settlement and policy changes were enough? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and please support the channel so we can continue to bring these important stories to light.